Hello, everybody. So this is the latest monthly update of what's going on, and we're going to continue our series of talks about how to use the kind of revival of the perennial wisdom for the 21st century through science and religion to reform all existing worldviews. So last time we did Islam, and this month we'll do China. Since we last spoke, since the last update, I mean, the events in Israel, Gaza have really kind of changed things, haven't they? And really, yeah, it's really motivating. Things are really moving ahead. So what I was going to do for the next one, okay, because I said I'll do China this month. Next month I'll do the whole, the kind of Israel, kind of Shia Islam, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, that all kind of thing, and how Christianity, the West kind of converges with Israel, dispensationalism, the Christian Zionists, and how all this kind of like religious nexus is really the cause of what's happening in Israel, and maybe say interesting things about what's happening that is not getting much kind of coverage. And yeah, we'll do that for next presentation. But now, for this month, we're going to go straight to China. Okay, so this sounds like an impossible task, doesn't it? How do you kind of revise the worldview of an atheist country using a kind of revival of the perennial wisdom for the 21st century through science and religion? And the reason why you can do it is because of the history of Marxism. Okay, so we think that basically there needs to be this great reform of what's happening in China, even though the Chinese CCP Communist Party get a lot of things right. There are kind of things that need to be transformed. And it sounds really kind of difficult, almost impossible to transform something as powerful as the CCP, 85 million people strong. Now, the idea of a revolution in China, I mean, any kind of revolution will be seen in China as reactionary because the revolution is ongoing. Okay, it's got this Marxist communist revolution has been unfolding, and let's say it's still unfolding. So any kind of revolution would be like a reaction against that revolution. Okay. Now the trick is that you're not going to kind of like depose the CCP. That's what kind of some people in the U.S. State Department would dream about. Kind of like overthrowing 85 million people strong Chinese Communist Party. And you also have to bear in mind that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is not the army of China. The PLA is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so the Communist Party is here to stay. Okay, and again, they've done a lot of good. Okay, what's happening in China, a lot of it's really great. And but the trick is, how do you take things to the next level, and how do you add certain things which might be missing, which might make things better, a kind of cherry on the cake kind of thing. And so that's what we're gonna propose today, that there really is this kind of like way of making this esoteric revolution happen in China. And actually, in the same way as in Islam, there's a reset switch with the name Imam Mahdi. Okay, we talked about in the last talk. In China, through this thing called dialectic, we'll go into this in detail. There is a kind of China has its own reset switch in effect, has its own mechanism for reform and revision. It's been said often that in the West, the political parties change, but the overall policies don't change. Okay, I mean, the overall kind of polity, the overall kind of economic, kind of social economic outlook remains fairly constant. But in China, the party stays the same, but things radically change. Radically change from something Leninist style, Leninist kind of no free markets whatsoever, to something completely, the most kind of wildest capitalism you have on the planet now, that started in the late 70s. Okay, so we think that there is this kind of like a kind of inbuilt mechanism for change, and it's a very recurring pattern. Also, another factor is that in socialism, there's been a recurring pattern of this idea of a return to Hegel. Okay, so from Marx onwards, even Marx himself abandoned Hegel, then later on would return to his ideas, and this recurs with people like Vladimir Lenin. And today we have left-leaning socialists like the philosopher Zizek, who calls himself an atheist Hegelian. Okay, so there's this recurring pattern of a return to Hegel, and we think this, the same return to Hegel can happen in China, because Marx, the whole Marxist edifice is really a derivation of the work of the philosopher Hegel. So we think that the key is really to, Marx said that his work was extracting the rational kernel from Hegel's mystical shell. But if you can actually make that mystical shell completely rational through science and reason and mathematics, then I think you can then kind of not make Marxism return to Hegel, but you can make Hegel return to the perennial wisdom. In fact, you make the entire Marxist edifice return back to the roots of Hegelism, which is the Hermetic, perennial, esoteric traditions. Okay, so that's a hugely ambitious thing to do, but we think that with this, kind of like a restoration of the perennial wisdom through science and technology, there really is this kind of opening to make it happen in China in a relatively short space of time. And we think it's really the next step of what's going to happen. Okay, why is this talk important? Now, this talk is important because, okay, China is, by purchase power parity terms, the world's biggest economy. It's huge. Okay, it's massive in terms of trading relationships with the rest of the world. Is the indispensable nation in terms of the hub of manufacturing, okay, and also a lot of raw materials and minerals and stuff. And also, it's really important to address this question of a reform within China that goes hand in hand with a reform in the West and reform in Islam, reform in Israel, reform in India, etc., a kind of convergent revolution. Because there does seem to be this idea of this Thucydides trap, this kind of idea of emerging superpower, and the incumbent superpower, i.e. USA, that they'll go to war. Okay, so this has been a recurring historical pattern, and there's reason to believe that it might repeat itself. It's not just Taiwan; it's lots of things. We have the trade war, we've got the tech war, and it might kind of plausibly spill over. And there's actually, some people say, will probably spill over to a hot war, which is going to be absolutely catastrophic. It's the end of the world. I mean, it's the end of growing up in the 70s, we thought that war with the Warsaw Pact, back in the 70s, kind of like Soviet Union versus the West, was cataclysmic. But this really is a cataclysmic war, and that kind of ties in with the next month's talk about what's happening in Israel, because that is where the building blocks, the way the puzzle blocks are stacked, that the what's happening in Israel and the surrounding countries will drag in Russia, China, and America, and Europe, and all the rest of the world. So anyway, yeah. So the idea of instigating this transformation to happen within the West, America, and Europe, and also within China, is important to stop this kind of like clash of civilizations. If we can reform the worldviews of these civilizations to become essentially like the same worldview, because they both have their root in this perennial wisdom. So that's the significance of this talk and why it's important. Okay. Personally, I have that colloquial expression, I have a dog in this fight, because personally, me, I am East and West. My family is, my kids are mixed race. My partner is Swiss. My ex-partner is English. I mean, very English Irish. So really, I was born in Hong Kong, but I grew up in the West, and culturally, in my head, I'm both basically. I'm East and West. So really, I have a kind of personal interest in this idea that you can somehow reconcile, the Orient, China, with the Occident. So it's actually be great if it happened, because I'm actually personally right in the middle of this kind of clash of civilizations. But I don't think it has to be a clash. I think it can be like a real kind of harmonious coming together, and I think that's what will happen eventually. Okay, so there might be some rough waters along the way, but I think inevitably it will become like one, kind of harmonious whole, and that's what we're going to explain why that will absolutely happen. Okay. Let me explain a bit about myself, my personal background. It's kind of funny. So I'm Chinese, okay, but I'm this ethnic group. We're called the Hakka people, which means guest people, okay. So, okay, what we speak is what was spoken in China 1,000 years ago. So we're like archaic Chinese. Okay. My mother and father, when they used to take me to London's Chinatown, they referred to Chinatown as Tong in Gai, which means the street of the Tang people. Now, Tang dynasty was 1,000 years ago. So we speak the dialect from 1,000 years ago, and we still refer to Chinese people as Tang dynasty people. Isn't that strange? Okay, now some historians say our origins are mysterious. Okay, it's not totally known why we have kept that identity. Okay, of 1,000 years ago, we migrated from north to south. There's one theory which says that we are courtesans. We're kind of people who were the kind of like people, maybe people higher up in the bureaucracy, in the kind of maybe the kind of like ruling classes who had to flee south with the kind of invasions. That's one theory. One of the reasons why people believe that is because we are especially bookish. Okay, in a society, a Confucian society, which values book learning, we are kind of noted for being especially into learning and books. Okay, so that's strange, isn't it? We're also called Jews of the Orient, and Christian missionaries thought we were lost tribes of Israel. Now that might become just kind of like a superficial observation. There might be something in it. What I think personally is that we are convergence of bloodlines, and I think from just personal observations over the years, looking at my family, looking at people, looking at different groups, different races and stuff, and seeing similarities, seeing commonalities. I think we are probably a mix of, maybe Jewish, maybe Arabic, maybe a whole load of bloodlines that kind of converge via the Silk routes, via trade links and stuff. We're like a blend, I think. And anyway, we kept that identity from 1,000 years ago. We went south to escape probably invading barbarians. Okay, and we had to escape probably because maybe we were ruling classes. Well, that's one theory. Okay, now there's a special relationship between my ethnic group and revolution. Okay, the 19th century Taiping Rebellion was generally all my ethnic group that took over vast swathes of China for several decades. Okay, and there's a funny connection because from studying my background, studying my personal family history, my family on my dad's side is probably remnants of that 19th century Taiping Rebellion. Okay, why do I think that? Because where we live in Hong Kong, okay, that's where remnants of the Taiping Rebellion escaped to. That's what historians think. But also, where the village was that was founded in the late 19th century by two brothers. Okay, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's like a horseshoe of mountains, and there's water in that horseshoe, and the village is right there. And when I first went back after finishing university, I was wondering what the hell were my ancestors doing moving here, for Christ's sake? This is in the middle of nowhere before the land was reclaimed. Now it's like become a major suburb of Hong Kong. But yeah, what happened was we think we were the kind of remnants of this rebellion who had to escape, and we had to change our names because my mother told me that my surname Sang is not actually our real name, because there is this famous Sang house which is quite near my village, and my mother says we're not of that same line, that same family line, so we kind of adopted their name to hide, I think. And my sister-in-law, she said in her family kind of history that her maiden name is Ho, which means river, and she said that her ancestors had to change their name at some point, and basically they were by a river, and they said, "Oh yeah, why don't we call ourselves Ho, the Ho family, the river family?" Okay, so yeah, so from that, I'm thinking there's a mystery in my personal family, and it's to do with the fact that we had to change our names and hide in Hong Kong after the Taiping Rebellion. The Manchu dynasty, which the Taiping Rebellion was against, this was kind of the Qing dynasty, Manchurian, who were called barbarians back then, but it's all China now. But they were the dominant dynasty, and yeah, there was a rule saying that the descendants of people who took part in rebellions, okay, 6 generations down, if you were discovered, then you were executed. Okay, that's really draconian and harsh, isn't it? That's the way things were done back then. And so if you took part in this rebellion, Taiping rebellion, you had to run, you had to hide, you had to change your name. So I think that's what happened. Okay, maybe a little more facetiously, I think there might be a bit of logic and idea that for six generations, you have to basically execute the descendants of rebels. Because I think if there's a rebel gene, if there's a kind of deviant gene, then I think probably my family has it, because I think there's something of like a crazy gene in my eccentricity gene in my family. I think I have it a little bit. My mother has it. I think my son has it as well. This is like an evil twinkle. I'm kidding. Yeah, various members of my family have it, and we think there's this kind of like deviant, rebellious gene in my family. And if that is so, then there's this idea that you should, kind of like try to eliminate those genes if you want a kind of like, a kind of like pliant, submissive society. Okay, so there might be a logic to what the Manchurians were trying to do. Okay, and also the famous Long March by the Communist Party was actually a march through Hakka family villages. Okay, so it was basically, again, this association between this ethnic group and revolution. There is also a relationship between my particular ethnic group and politics, because about 20, 30 years ago, I mean, the free states in the world that called themselves Chinese, okay, which will be back 20 years ago, it would have been Taiwan, Singapore, China, and Hong Kong. Okay, all four leaders were my ethnic group. We're only about less than 5% of the entire group of people who call themselves Chinese. So there is something in the gene pool, there's something funny in the cultural makeup, which actually predisposes a certain kind of like views on, society, views on revolution, etc. And I think it's, even without knowing all this stuff, I kind of like, kind of had this kind of like desire to, just change things really. Yeah. So I think it's maybe genetic. Okay. On my mother's side of the family, she was, her family lost out in the communist revolution because her family were quite rich landowners. But after the revolution, they lost all their land. They really were dispossessed. So even though my ethnic group are very, very represented in the communist revolution and even in the Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping was my ethnic group, but also in 1978, 79, 5 members of the kind of standing committee, 5 of the 9 members of the standing committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party were my ethnic group. So again, this is kind of like statistically, that's something unusual. But anyway, even though we were kind of overrepresented in the Communist Revolution and the Communist Party, my family personally, on mom's side, they lost out in the revolution. Okay. My grandfather really was unhappy with the revolution. He really give you some personal details of my life. I mean, my mother told me that her father, my grandfather, when she was a kind of teenage girl, he told her to basically escape, go to Hong Kong. That's what she was told. And he really resisted the Communist Party. He really kind of like didn't like what happened because his family was dispossessed. And one of the saddest days of my, actually I didn't feel that much sadness. I was only 6, 7 years old, but was in 1976. Okay, Chairman Mao died, and then shortly after that, my mother received a letter from China, and it was basically a letter saying that her father had died. Okay, so that was quite sad. And one of his vivid memories of childhood. Okay, anyway, he was put in prison for I think just being rebellious and being a bit deviant and various other reasons. So he was like a political prisoner. And after Mao died, he was released because there's no reason for him to be there. But he didn't do anything wrong, basically. So he was like a political prisoner who was kind of broken by prison. He's kind of like his health really suffered. And I think. But anyway, the reason why I bring up that story is to say that even though people might say, "Oh yeah, that you dislike the Communist Party then because of that," well, no, because really, you got to look at things, in a great grand sweep of things. That the Chinese Communist Party has also done a lot of good, and also you've got to see things, the negative things as well. what I'm trying to say is basically I take a balanced view of things. Even there's reason for me to, be a kind of like have a very negative view of the Chinese Communist Party, because I'm also living in the West. I also have a very positive view of what they've done, and of things that have happened that are very good in China. And also, it also gives me hope that basically you can build on what's good and what's positive that's happened, since the communist revolution, and they can basically build on that to something even better. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from. That's why I told this little story. Okay. Now, okay, so we're gonna just finish with the personal bits, and just to go over this kind of like this kind of esoteric sweep of Chinese history right up to the present, Hegel, Marxism, etc., and how we're going to bring it back to the perennial philosophy. But we're going to show how it really begins with the Yellow Emperor, and this kind of esoteric, apocalyptic, messianic current runs all the way through 5,000 years of Chinese history. 10 years ago, I was given this talk called Revolutionary Movements and How to Start One, and I surveyed 1,000 years of Chinese history, and I showed that there was this kind of a apocalyptic, esoteric aspect to all the revolutions that happened in China over the past 1,000 years. So you got this kind of like, White Lotus movements, the kind of like the Manichaean apocalyptic Buddhist red turban army. You got the triads, you got the Taiping Rebellion. You have all these kind of like revolutionary movements which have this esoteric, prophetic, apocalyptic aspect. Practically all the revolutions which happened, and no, I mean every single one happened has the same template. Well, since then, I realized that going back another 1,000 years, you can actually see the same pattern. Okay, you had the red turbans in the kind of 11th, 13th century, etc. But then you had the kind of yellow turban movements, which were Taoist, in the first, second, and third centuries. So another 1,000 years swathe of Chinese history, and you find this pattern again. Okay, in the first century, there was the 19th century Taiping Rebellion, but in the first century, there's also a Taiping Rebellion based on the same kind of principles. It's kind of bringing the kind of grand perfection to the earth, a kind of apocalyptic mass movement. And also, what was very strong in the first, second, third centuries was what's called these kind of Taoist messianic kind of movements, which really adapted the ideas of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, appeared in the 6th century. Now, in the course of the kind of following centuries, it was changed. So Lao Tzu was an incarnation of the Tao, but this incarnation of the Tao will keep reappearing as a kind of like apocalyptic messianic leader, a religious leader. And one of the forms it took was in the first century, there was a historical character called Li Hong, Li Hong, and he became a personification of this idea of a kind of like manifestation of the Tao that appears as a messianic revolutionary leader. So many of these Li Hong characters appeared after that. And now this is relevant for the 21st century because, the Fulan Gong, the dodgy cult, who are very against the Chinese Communist Party, the leader calls himself Li Hongzi. You see, Li Hongzi. So he's actually changed his name. He also changed his birth date to that of Buddha to kind of give himself a kind of mystique, a kind of name that is kind of like of that kind of Taoist messianic, and also Buddhist. He also thinks is Maitreya kind of thing. So he's kind of taken this Fulan Gong cult, who were crushed by the Communist Party. You still see them in Chinatown doing their meditations and trying to promote the culty ideas. Okay, so my view of the Fulan Gong, they are a dodgy cult, and they are. I think they did a bit of qigong, a bit of like guy claims he's the Messiah, the chosen one. I don't think he is. I think basically he's just like a dodgy cult leader. What's really bad is that the Fulan Gong in America work with organizations. Like one is backed by Steve Bannon, who's actually calling for like a war with China. The idea that America should go to war with China sooner rather than later, because China's getting stronger and stronger. And the Fulan Gong actually work with some of kind of Steve Bannon associated organizations. So you see, I mean, you have this kind of, you know, religious organization that's actually working towards war. So not very, you know, kind of like a very kind of like spiritually beneficent. Okay, we digress. Anyway, so Li Hong was this kind of messianic character in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and was a recurring kind of archetype. And also, it's worth mentioning that the Tang dynasty, when they were established, okay, there's this dynasty that my own ethnic group kind of refer back to. The first Tang emperor actually tried to, you know, present himself as the personification of this Li Hong kind of like eschatology, this kind of whole messianic kind of like wave of using Taoism in this kind of political way. Okay. We kind of like think that as we learn more, that this kind of apocalyptic mystical trend will go even further back in time. But if we go right back to the beginning of China, the Yellow Emperor, again, we find this mystical archetype. So in my head, I'm missing kind of like 2,000 years of kind of like, you know, Yellow Emperor starts 5,000 years ago. So it's kind of up to the kind of like the 1st century rebellions. There will be this recurring archetype, I believe, which is still a gap in my knowledge, which I need to fill in. So it's 5,000 years of like Chinese history to actually learn and fill in. But anyway, right from the beginning, the person who's supposed to have started Chinese civilization, the Yellow Emperor, is also of this mythic esoteric archetype. Now, I first learned this in a Joseph Campbell book, Joseph Campbell, bunch of interviews, The Power of Myth, where I was first introduced to the idea that the Yellow Emperor himself was a part of this mythic archetype, one of the heroes with 1,000 faces, that he had these mystical experiences, went off to, you know, kind of do his meditations and came back and founded Chinese civilization. So this kind of mystical archetype goes way back to the Yellow Emperor. Okay, probably in the first 2,000-3,000 years, it recurs. That's my gap in my knowledge. And then from the 1st centuries onwards, we see it very clearly in the historical record. It's this recurring kind of esoteric, apocalyptic, messianic strain that really just you know, permeates and kind of punctuates and drives Chinese history along up to the present. Okay, up to the present, which is the Chinese Communist Party now. Okay. So the revolution that happened under Chairman Mao, okay, it's interesting to note that even then, Chairman Mao was, okay, very influenced by the Taiping Rebellion of the 19th century, also other revolutions in the past as well, in particular the Taiping Rebellion, but also by a myth, okay, a mythic archetype. In the 1970s, there was this TV show called The Water Margin. It's a famous Chinese legend, kind of literary work. It was very good. I remember it was the best TV of my childhood, some of it. It was basically about this idea of a kind of mythic heroes who are rebels, basically, and they come back periodically through history to instigate revolutions in China and in the world. Okay. And anyway, so this mythic archetype, this prophetic, apocalyptic, revolutionary archetype also propelled Mao Zedong to launch a revolution to happen in China that was based on Marxism, that is itself derived from the work of Hegel, which itself is derived from the Hermetic, Esoteric, Perennial Wisdom tradition. Okay, so we think that we need to go back to Hegel, this recurring pattern in socialism. We need China to go back to Hegel, and Chinese kind of academics and CCP thinkers are more sympathetic to Hegel than in most kind of Western countries. Okay. In particularly Anglo-Saxon countries, Hegel really has a kind of like bad reputation because of his supposed links with authoritarianism. Okay. But anyway, this repeating pattern in socialism of a return to Hegel, we think it can be made to happen in China. But we need to have a deeper dive into Hegel to understand Hegel in order to understand how exactly this change will happen. So we need to examine Hegel and his dialectic. You know, when people talk about Hegel, people talk about Hegel doing a retrospective analysis and the Owl of Minerva looking back on things. Yes, he did. He did this amazing retrospective analysis of the revolutions that happened before his time, which and as a young man, which was the English Revolution, French Revolution, and the American Revolution. Now Hegel said, this is important. He said that basically his critical point was that his secret spiritual revolution in the zeitgeist. He called it this kind of secret revolution that had to happen for the physical revolution to happen. Now, this secret revolution in the zeitgeist is exactly this war of ideas, this war of worldviews that occurred from these ideas that appeared during the Renaissance, this perennial wisdom that was taken up by organizations like Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, and that then went underground and then fomented these revolutions. So the leader of the parliamentary forces, Lord Fairfax, the Fairfax family were the most prominent Freemason family in England for many generations. It's the Fairfax family that introduced George Washington, probably the most famous Freemason, to Freemasonry in America. And then, the French Revolution also spearheaded by Freemasons. Anyway, the retrospective analysis of Hegel was basically, yes, there was this secret revolution of ideas from the Renaissance, this perennial wisdom, which would then lead to these ideas of a better world, of human dignity, then equality, liberty, fraternity, meritocracy, kind of overthrowing the past order. What's less known about Hegel was he also did a prospective forward analysis of the future early on in his career. Because he wrote that a society at an adequate level of Bildung means a German word meaning education, a kind of holistic education. A society at an adequate level of Bildung will be ready for new ideas about God, he wrote. So he also believed in his work were that recovery of not new ideas, but really the old ideas about God, well, new to the German people. So in his own work, he believed that his work was actually exactly this recovery of the old Hermetic tradition in a kind of new format for a people ready to receive it. Okay, now they weren't. Okay, that's another story. But that was his aim. Okay, another one of his aims was that he believed that the reform of all knowledge, this recurring pattern in the Renaissance, this idea of a reform of all knowledge, he believed that this reform of all knowledge would lead the revolution to happen in Germany. Okay, so Hegel, can you see, is a very prospective agent looking into the future, trying to instigate revolution and trying to instigate new ideas of God to penetrate into society. Okay, so what he did was to really prepare the way for Marxism. So even though Hegel didn't really, didn't instigate the revolution to happen in Germany, the person who ran with his ideas is Karl Marx, and Karl Marx is called a left Hegelian or a young Hegelian. He is a follower, along with Friedrich Engels, of the ideas of the young Hegel, the left-wing revolutionary ideas of Hegel. Okay, so really, if Hegel's work is really derivative of the Hermetic tradition, a very good book is Glenn Alexander McGee's Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition. I mean, if you are kind of doubtful of this really fact, then read that book, and there'll be no doubt in your mind that really Hegel's work is really the Hermetic tradition in philosophic language. That's what it is. Okay, so but in turn, Karl Marx's work is derivative of Hegel. Okay, so this is now what we need to explain is what happened. Okay, what happened was that in the 19th century, okay, people weren't ready for new ideas about God. What happened is that society, Western civilization, took a very atheistic turn. Okay, if during the Romantic period, people were seeing a kind of loss of spiritual values and things like that, and Hegel was trying to kind of recover the old religion, in his own time, actually, and also the generations that followed, basically, there was this real upswing in atheism. Of course, there's Charles Darwin, okay, his work was a major factor in this kind of like rise of atheism. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels read Origin of Species weeks after it was published, and they wrote to each other, congratulating themselves on how their worldview was totally in line with this Darwinian thinking. But also another huge thinker around this time, another left Hegelian, okay, another follower of Hegel, who started out as a follower of Hegel, but then broke with Hegel, was Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote a very influential critique of Christianity. And he was another instrumental kind of factor in this rise of atheism. Now, Charles Darwin himself read Feuerbach's book, but also Karl Marx and Engels read Feuerbach's book. And it's interesting, in their letters, they talked about how Feuerbach had broken the spell of Hegel for them. Do you see, basically in their minds, they started out with this kind of like, you know, a kind of sympathetic or kind of like a willing to entertain the kind of Hermeticism, the kind of mystery of Hegel. But within their own careers, Marx and Engels basically broke with Hegel, and along with that kind of like rise of atheism current of that time, they were swept along with it. But I would argue that's what went wrong with Marxism. Okay, and we think that the real solution to socialism and Marxism is really not a kind of like Zizek, kind of like atheistic Hegelian return to Hegel. We think it's a full kind of return of the mystical shell of Hegel in rational terms and scientific terms. So we think that the return of Hegel needs to take the form of a full return to the perennial wisdom, completely revived through science technology. Okay, we think that's what's needed. And okay, in terms of going back to China, okay, so what we have in China today is Marxism. Okay, the atheism in China today is derivative of the rise of atheism in the 19th century. Now, what was lost by this rise in atheism, what was lost, okay, was the kind of metaphysical foundations of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Well, one of the things, the baby that went out with the bathwater with the rise of atheism is the loss of ideas, the foundations of ideas like human dignity and the ideas of the sanctity of human life, okay, and a whole bunch of other values which were really spiritual. That even today, militant atheists and new atheists, they lament that, yeah, we've lost the baby. We can't, you know, establish ideas of human dignity and the sanctity of human life and even human rights and liberalism with the existing worldview. Now, in a country like China, that's basically completely adopted the kind of left atheistic version of Hegel via Marx, okay, what we have is basically, yes, Chinese Communist Party members will say that human rights is also basically the ability to eat. It's basically economic development. There's also the ability to have a house and shelter. We think that is absolutely necessary, and it's absolutely necessary for kind of like, you know, the kind of like higher human rights, if you like, the ideas of human dignity, ideas of kind of, you know, kind of like a free speech, the right to, you know, self-choice, lots of different things that basically are underpinned by human dignity that have been lost in the course of time with the rise of atheism. You know, even though the West is a kind of champion of human rights and human dignity, what I think is happening is that since the rise of atheism, is that basically the foundations of liberalism and human rights have been eroded. So I think over time, we're seeing in the West a kind of diminishing of human rights and human dignity over time. And in China, yes, there is a rise of that kind of like basic human rights to travel, to have a job, have a, you know, kind of nice life and to eat, basically. And what I see is maybe the two can meet together at some point and then rise together. That's what I think is the best pattern. So it's not, you know, one side is right, one side is wrong. I think what I think is that both sides have a part of the puzzle. China's doing well economically. There's something about the way it governs capitalism, which is it's doing very well. Okay, and there's something about what the West is losing in terms of certain ideas of human dignity, human rights, etc., free speech, and all that kind of stuff, which made Europe great. But it's losing it. It's losing it. Okay, we're seeing it. We're seeing this happen. And if you can recover the foundations that were lost in the 19th century through Darwin, Feuerbach, etc., Ludwig Feuerbach's work, then I think you can basically, yeah, I mean, have the two sides converge to a kind of point where the West takes the best of China, and vice versa, the China is able to take the best of the West, and we can basically have a kind of merger of the two. Okay, so really. What I think is that China is really, you know, even though it seems like an impossible dream, is actually set up in such a way to be very receptive to this message of recovering the perennial wisdom through science and technology. China is a very scientific and technological civilization. now. And the Chinese Academy of Sciences is probably the closest thing we've got in the modern world to the House of Salomon in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. It's kind of like a institute that kind of uses science and to better society. Okay, so we think that it's kind of like revival of these Renaissance ideas of utopia, of kind of kind of political philosophy, personal morality, which were lost with the rise of atheism, can really be restored, not just for the West, okay, but also I think can be restored to China as a return to Hegel, and also as a kind of return to Hegel back to the perennial wisdom. Okay, so that's about it. So basically, we have kind of covered a lot of ground. And actually, sorry, what I forgot to talk about actually is the actual dialectic. Okay, the actual dialectic itself. We need to cover that now. So basically, the dialectic. What Hegel talks about was this dialectic process. When in recent months, it's become crystal clear to me that there's a unity between Hegel's dialectic, the myth cycle, and also the prophetic cycle, but also T.S. Kuhn's structure of revolutions. So if you want a kind of revolution in science that's going to recover the perennial wisdom, then this is like the mother of all scientific revolutions. Okay, so we think there's a unity between Hegel's dialectic and all these other ideas. Let's go into this. Okay, so this is really important because it really kind of makes it kind of like really happen, really. So dialectic thinking. There was a speech given by Xi Jinping about a few years back, and he basically talks about dialectic thinking. Okay, and he goes at length to explain that Mao Zedong, all the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao himself, applied dialectic thinking to their policies, to their outlook, and that dialectic thinking is alive and well in China. Okay, it's really important. Now, what is the dialectic? Now, the dialectic is something that derives from epistemology. What it is this idea of it's this idea that in the realm of ideas, there is this idea of thesis. Okay, the thesis is like an idea, and then the idea kind of like becomes self-contradictory. Kind of like over time, it kind of like loses its consistency, is challenged by other ideas. So then a kind of like antithesis appears. Now that antithesis challenges the thesis, and what you have then is a synthesis which unites the thesis, the old thesis, and a new antithesis, and that's the new thesis. Okay, the synthesis. And then the cycle begins again, and then synthesis becomes the thesis, and then it kind of starts, losing its consistency. It kind of falls apart, becomes challenged, and the cycle begins again. New antithesis, new synthesis, new thesis. Okay, so that is dialectic process, and that is what Marxists would say is the process of history, and that's what Hegel applied to this idea that what's happening in the mind in epistemology is also happening in society. So these kind of like the antithesis, thesis are factions of society that challenge each other, and that's how science. That's how society, and later we'll explain science. That's how it progresses over time. Okay, so if we substitute the word kind of like Camelot for thesis, and then Camelot and disarray for the thesis, kind of groaning under weight of its own contradictions, and then a kind of like the mythic quest hero, kind of returning with this kind of apotheosis, this kind of like mystical holy grail knowledge with the forces of light that challenge the old thesis to make a new synthesis, and Camelot restored. Okay, so what it means is that the myth cycle of this kind of like Camelot ideal society falling to disarray, periodically needing this kind of like this kind of revival, this kind of like antithesis, this revolution to revive it, recurring again and again, it is really like the same template. Okay, now say the myth cycle, Joseph Campbell's work, the myth cycle. What's critical to the myth cycle is this idea of the apotheosis, this mystical aspect of the mythic quest hero going into the dark forest to have this mystical experience, the Holy Grail, and then return that mystical knowledge back to society to restore Camelot. That's the critical aspect. Now, Hegel, okay, Hegel believed he was God. Okay, you read introductory books on philosophy, and you're introduced to this idea. Simple books like Philosophy for Beginners. You introduce this idea that Hegel believed he was God, which is part of the whole Hermetic tradition, the whole Renaissance, Freemason, Rosicrucian Hermetic tradition. So this idea of apotheosis, and also this idea of becoming one with God or having this mystical knowledge as being critical for the dialectic, obviously that is no problem for Hegel. Okay. In fact, in Hegel's scheme, in his own scheme, he talks about this idea of the person called the genius of the age. So in his own dialectic work, he is saying that basically the zeitgeist is personified by a person. So this is almost like the Taoist, kind of manifestation, the Li Hong Taoist manifestation, or the avatar, messianic character. That basically, even in Hegel's work, he's talking about this kind of embodiment of the zeitgeist that is then the instrument for, in his own writings, articulating the will of the age and realizing the will of the age. So in Hegel's work, he's saying that in certain critical times, this dialectic process will be driven to someone who's the equivalent of mythic quest hero. Okay. Now, if we have a full return to Hegel, then basically it is, it's not out of the question that it can actually reduce the kind of historic progression to dialectic, but also reintroduce the idea of this genius of the age. Okay, now, if we think about T.S. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, this book, very influential book, okay, it's where the word paradigm shift comes from. So scientific paradigm shift, that this word was then borrowed generally, is the book that made paradigm shift fashionable. It really put the word paradigm shift on a map. Okay, so in terms of scientific paradigm shift, now T.S. Kuhn is not talking about apotheosis, people becoming one with God and stuff. He's talking about, kind of physicists and scientists and, cosmologists basically just forming new worldviews and these new kind of scientific paradigms. But if as we think is the case, that it really is this kind of mother of all paradigm shifts, whereby this apotheosis, this idea of one consciousness, people become one with God, consciousness and God are one and the same, this esoteric knowledge that there's a kind of like arranging of all the scientific jigsaw puzzle pieces in a way that coalesce together to form a perfect picture of the universe and a metaphysical outlook that's identical to the perennial wisdom, with the central idea that everyone is God, or we are all one consciousness, and that is God. Then you can say that basically, yes, this is a scientific paradigm shift, but you can say it's the mother of all paradigm shifts, because it's basically all science shifting back to the mindset that gave rise to science in the first place, back in the origins of the Renaissance. So it means that dialectic, mythic quest hero, prophetic, apocalypse, unveiling of the hidden thing, to scientific structure of revolutions, is all really one and the same archetype. And we take this narrative, we take this archetype basically, and we then use it in a way to frame it in a Hegelian sense and say, look, this is what kind of like a kind of full revival of a kind of return to Marx back to Hegel looks like, because it really is a kind of like a full kind of like a return of the perennial wisdom that then it kind of allows us to bring together dialectic with mythic quest archetype with the structure of scientific revolutions. But then that is your basic narrative and your basic template to introduce to Marxists and kind of later, maybe a younger generation of theorists within the Chinese Communist Party, to say that this is the next step of the dialectic process. I got to say, Xi Jinping's speech about dialectic, he was actually at pains to point out that we should not go into the metaphysical and the spiritual. Okay, he might have said this with the Fulan Gong in mind, or other kind of like spiritual kind of like movements that are bubbling up in China. okay, so but the thing is about dialectic is that the current status quo cannot anticipate what the antithesis is going to look like. If you can completely restore Hegel's mystical shell in completely rational terms, then I think that is the path that you can use to really communicate the perennial wisdom into kind of thinkers and future thinkers of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the other kind of ingredient of this kind of like world revolution is if the worldview, this revival of the perennial wisdom in science, with science and technology, also includes this sword and stone kind of like the creation and manifestation of true artificial intelligence, then that's what I think it takes to really kind of penetrate into the kind of like the kind of polity, the kind of like political ruling class of China in the future, to make really cause this kind of like kind of transformation of thinking, dialectic process to happen within the Chinese Communist Party. And if you can also make the same process happen in America and Europe, and as we discussed in the last talk in Islam, and also all the rest of the world, India, Russia, etc., then I think that is really a process that can take decades, and it's not going to take like centuries, but can take a few decades to unfold, and which will kind of like bring about this great convergent revolution of worldview. Okay. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. So the next talk, which I was almost done. I might do it in the next few days. I mean, before next month. What is going to go into that whole Israel, Hamas, kind of like Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, Alawite, Christian dispensationalism, Europe, the whole shebang, the whole thing, and kind of put it in a way that says new things, but put it in a way that kind of like gives new ideas. I mean, like sociologists and political scientists talk about wicked problems that seem totally intractable. And when we think about the situation in the Middle East, that is the most kind of like, your mother of all wicked problems, isn't it? I mean, how do you break this cycle of violence? I mean, how do you do it? The answer is that these wicked problems can't be solved because it's like these great puzzle blocks of the puzzle involving religion cannot be moved. So in order to solve the great puzzle, you need to shift these religious puzzle blocks. But you don't shift these religious puzzle blocks by saying, let's all be happy militant atheists and forget religion. What you need to do is you need to go into religion. You need to reform it. You basically need to reform. Religion does change. It changes at a glacial pace. But in certain critical junctures in world history, these real kind of like abrupt changes do happen. So even if in Hegel's time, people weren't prepared for new ideas about God and people went atheistic, I believe now what's happening in the Middle East might trigger and set up the conditions for people really to, reach out for some new interpretation of what is Judaism, what is, kind of the prophecies in Christianity, what's the true meaning of Islam, the esoteric mysteries, and all these kind of like factions, even the psychedelic trance party that got hit by Hamas in the what occurred a few weeks ago. Basically this esoteric outlook is really kind of like permeating all these kind of like different aspects of Israeli society, of the Muslim world, of Europe and America. If you can have this kind of like unifying reinterpreting of all these different factions, I think you can really, that's the real way to solve these horrible problems in the world. Okay, so if we can avoid Thucydides' trap between China and America, then I think in the next talk, we'll basically go into some detail and go through Islam, Judaism, and the Western Christian Zionism, and show how there is a way of kind of like kind of bringing these different factions toward a common understanding. Okay, so we'll leave it there, and we'll return soon.